Excellent. Okay, I'd like everyone to welcome Dr. Satrajit Ghosh, a principal research scientist at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT and an assistant professor of ot- of otolaryngology at Harvard Medical School, where he directs the Senseable Intelligence Group. Take it away, Satra.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Let me just share my screen. Just going to make sure everybody can see it.
Good. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to the Rocket Organizing Committee for inviting me to be part of this. Today, I hope over the next 30 minutes or so, present a little bit about DANDY, which is an acronym. It stands for Distributed Archives for Neurophysiology Data Integration. But the focus of this talk is kind of thinking about how a lab could move to the cloud, or what the cloud could be used for in the context of scientific research in the cloud. The way I talk about it is both a data archive and perhaps more importantly, a collaboration space for neurophysiology projects. As I start, DANDY is a collaborative effort. It involves a team at MIT, Dartmouth College, Kitware, and Catalyst Neuro kind of helping out with various components of this. And I should point out Yarek, also known as Yaroslav, is on the participant panelist today and can answer questions while I'm talking. So if you enter things into chat, he will, and he's my co-PI on this project, which is supported by the US Brain Initiative, as well as receives support from the AWS Public Dataset program. But DANDY would not be complete without collaborators. And towards that, we have collaborators from an entity called the Neurodata Without Borders, which is a particular type of standard that's being used to describe neurophysiology data. The Brain Cell Data Center, which is another initiative funded as part of the US Brain Initiative, the Allen Institute for Brain Science, a bunch of different communities, including the Brain Imaging Data Structure community, the OpenScope project, which is another project coming out of the Allen Institute, the International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility, and the International Brain Initiative. And I do want to give a little shout out to Lee Kamensky from the Chung Lab at MIT for at least this talk, because I'll be demonstrating a bunch of things that comes out of the Chung Lab that Lee has been instrumental in putting together. With that, I'm going to cover kind of four broad areas in this talk: complexity and standardization, the capabilities of this thing that we call DANDY, social and technical challenges, and future directions. So let me start off with complexity and standardization. And I'm sure that most of you are not neuroscientists in this call, so I thought I would give a little bit of overview of what neuroscientists are looking at. And this might be true of many other domains. They're looking at data that comes from various scales of resolution, all the way from subcellular to whole brain scale. They're looking at data from multiple species, from various corners of the planet. And towards this, they're trying to develop theories which involve computational models, which involve coming up with new experimental designs, as well as driving biological applications. And these may be clinical in nature, like how to solve Alzheimer's disease. They could be behavioral in nature, being able to predict sleep and other kinds of behavior. But at the basis of a lot of these biological applications is just enhancing knowledge, the basics of science as we understand it about human behavior and biology, to drive the generation of this. And over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen an incredible assortment of new instruments, new ways of doing science, and new analytic processes come online to help with these questions. And together with these tools, we've seen an increase in data. The scales of data have changed. We're getting better descriptors of data, and we're connecting the history of knowledge through a lens of provenance. But to be able to do all of these things, one needs infrastructure. And this infrastructure can be used for dissemination, for search, for visualization, for computation, for collaboration and coordination, fairness and efficiency. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with FAIR at this point in time, it's an acronym that stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And it's one of those things that a lot of data infrastructures or compute infrastructures or software infrastructures are moving to embrace as part of making things fair. So let me start with something from the Allen Institute. This is a simple workflow, or so it seems. It involves a whole sequence of steps all the way from the animal and operations on the animal to data collection in the live animal and post after the data collection is done to get different kinds of data at different stages of this process. And one of the things that it uses is this instrument called NeuroPixels. And this was developed in 2013 to 2017 period. It has gone over various revisions. It's an electrode that measures electrical activity, surrounding electrical activity, wherever it's inserted into the brain, that can record over 700 neurons over multiple regions if you just insert 2 of these. And today, many of these electrodes are being used in multiple settings in multiple parts of the brain. Now, this high resolution comes at a cost. If you're just measuring 385 active channels at about 30 kilohertz, that results in about a sampling rate of about 22 megabytes per second. And 13 hours of recording generates about a terabyte of data. This is very different from the landscape of neuroscience as it used to be. And today, one can do this in awake behaving animals and in other species. And so we're getting a throughput that hasn't been seen before. The various labs are not used to this throughput or the scale of data. And so one of the questions is, how can you deal with it from an end-to-end perspective? Let me give another example. This is a light sheet imaging of an ex vivo human brain. So a slice of human brain that's been taken out, cleared, stained with various kinds of substances to highlight certain structures, and imaged through a light sheet imaging microscope. And I'll talk more about this later on in this talk. I'm just simply showing you a slide of it. And this is about a 2mm slide image at about a 2.5 micron resolution. We're storing currently about 22 of these slides from a given human brain with the expectation that this is going to expand out to the full human brain. The current data set is at about 14.7 terabytes. This is going to expand out to about 200 terabytes when that hemisphere of the human brain is done. And that changes, again, the dynamics of how you compute on this, how you stored this, what formats do you use? And that's what we are kind of trying to address. Here's another example. This is a paper in eLife about a software called Spike Interface, a unified framework for spike sorting. For those of you unfamiliar with spike sorting, it's one of the basic mechanisms that people use on neuroscientific data of certain kind to give rise to an estimate that's important for downstream calculations. And there are various algorithms out there. So what this group was trying to do was to figure out ways in which they could get agreement across various algorithms and show which of the algorithms are able to detect spikes appropriately and detect the underlying neural units that fly. And they put this data on Dandy as a way of not only sharing the data, but also showing that the same mechanism could be applied to other data sets on the Dandy archive to be able to evaluate the quality of algorithms and perhaps data sets as part of this process. And the final example I'll give in this introductory phase is this project, which involves 4 different sites. There's a ex vivo human brain that's imaged through a magnetic resonance imaging scanner at MGH, Mass General Hospital in Boston. It then ships over to Boston University, where the team there does optical coherence tomography, which is taking views of this frozen tissue and then slicing it off in pieces. And then those slices are sent over to Italy, where they get imaged with a microscope. And finally, the data from that microscope kind of gets to a place where the folks from Columbia University can look at it to do certain types of cell counting. So this involves 4 different techniques at 4 different sites, needed integration and needed standardization of the files. But most importantly, it needed a place for collaboration so that all of the people could work on it. And in the context of this particular project, as part of the consortium that it's a member of, the data also needed to be prospectively available as they were collecting these at different stages. And to support this, we developed the Dandy archive to support many of these use cases and others. At its core, it's a web application and an API server to help kind of constrain the cognitive space of neuroscientists. We're using standardized descriptors, and some of these are also being developed and supported by the US Brain Initiative. And then together with this, we're deploying a Jupyter Hub alongside to perform analytics. Now, that's all the things that sit on the web. There's also components that sit in the labs and the collaborators' labs, which use Python clients and a tool called Datalab to help support access to this data in a virtual sense. Now, I'll go into some of these details a little later on, but I want to put this up there as a framework that could be applied to many different domains. Many domains are producing data. You need analytics, you need standardization, and we want to put it all together. And all of this is currently being served through AWS for the various pieces that are being developed. Dandy is built on open source technologies. Every component of Dandy is openly available. And our goal was really to create a stack that many different parts of the scientific ecosystem of neuroscience could interact with, whether they be hardware developers, software developers, scientists, data contributors, or even citizen scientists. Anybody can come to Dandy, sign up, go to the hub and play with the data. Yes, they might need some knowledge, and we're working with various teams like Neuromatch Academy and other institutions like the INCF to figure out better training materials, better educational materials. But now all of this data that scientists are collecting in their labs and putting online is accessible to a much larger community of individuals who might be interested in this. Could be high school students, could be college students, could be grad students, postdocs, or just general people interested in science. We have not covered every aspect of our proposed plan yet. What we have fairly well right now is the web UI, some external web apps, our Jupyter Hub deployment, interaction with some other services like Metacell, and the use of Datalab to represent the information, the archival content of this data set. We made some inroad towards doing conversion of data into standardized form and to use certain other infrastructure and libraries to be able to understand and manipulate the data better. And I'll go into some of those details. There's still a few other things kind of downstream from this. One of the projects that I have helped run over the last 10 years is a project called NIPI, which is a workflow framework for doing neuroimaging related operations. We're trying to bring some of those similar kind of consistencies of algorithms and operations towards the kind of data that we are storing in this archive. So let me go on to what this archive is and describe a little bit of the capabilities. I've showed this figure before. We're covering a fairly large space of this neuroscientific space. In the last year, we've grown from about 2 terabytes of data to 42 terabytes of data. And within this one of these consortiums, the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network, that has grown from 11 gigabytes to about 17.5 terabytes of data. We have data from 4 species, various multimodal instruments that kind of bring data to it. Longitudinal data, this involves multiple sessions from participants in each data set. Behavioral data, so there's optogenetic data, free behaving data, and video recordings of individuals coming to it. And right now there's about 59 Dandy sets containing data, but if you go to the website, you might find more than that. And that's intentional. We want this to be a collaboration space. We want people to come to this archive and say, I'm going to start collecting this data. And we want others to kind of say, I'm interested in the data. They might collaborate on the experimental design protocol to improve the richness of data. And that's intentional. And right now we have about 2,300 participants worth of data across those 4 species in the archive. We also work with community standards. And the intent of these standards, and I'm not expecting people here to be familiar with these standards, but the idea is to help move the community towards better representation of data and metadata. So not just the basic mechanics of file formats, but how do you describe the content that's stored in there? And that's critically important for trying to think about moving the lab to the cloud in terms of a collaborative lab where anybody can come to and understand the data that you're producing. And this helps make harmonization easier. We've produced tools and clients which allow you to organize and validate data on the client side before you put it out into the cloud. And this reduces the bottleneck somebody else faces when they access data. So we are not a Google Drive or a Dropbox place where you could submit any data that you have into the archive. It has to be properly organized, and we help you with that organization to get it out there. We're using this format called Neurodata Without Borders for a certain type of data. And we use it because it's an open standard. It's well maintained and it's standards driven. It supports complex experiments in the neuroscience space and multiple neural data types. It supports large data sets because it uses HDF5 as the underlying container format for the data, and therefore has access from Python and MATLAB clients. And various aspects of the scientific research process can be stored through a schema-driven form into this HDF5 container. But the complexity is often in the metadata. So as our science evolves, so does our language to describe it. And what we are doing is we are using the W3C Prov model as a way of connecting these different pieces of data to a rich metadata scheme. And what we are interested in is that the information is captured at the point of data generation rather than at the point of publication. We're not seeing the archive as an end product of your scientific research workflow, but how it can be part of and at the beginning of your research workflow. So we're working with various hardware developers and software systems to help people capture such rich metadata into a state where then it can be used to describe the entities that they're putting in the archive. With that kind of rich metadata schema, on one side, we're using JSON and JSON LD as the representation of these descriptors. And on the other side, we're providing UI elements because many of the neuroscientists working with such data are not familiar with JSON and JSON LD. They need kind of interfaces to interact with this archive through much more familiar interfaces like forms or other such elements. And so we're providing that to help the community kind of enrich the information space that's in Dandy. So how fair is Dandy? I mentioned fair earlier, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. All of our schema uses standard ontologies. All the elements carry unique identifiers. And to reduce the cognitive overload that comes with the word data set, we coined and increased the cognitive load by creating the word Dandy set. But it has a very specific meaning. It's an organized collection of assets, files, with both file level and data set level metadata generated from an experiment or project. And so all of these things carry unique identifiers, and they're searchable on dandyarchive.org, and the linked data is exposed. All of the elements are accessible. We're using standard containers. These are kind of standardized formats that exist in the community, whether it's NWV or NIFTIA, but also kind of generic formats like TIFF and HDF5, with new formats like the next generation file format, which I'll briefly touch on later, coming online. Metadata is exposed as JSON and JSON LD alongside data, so you can do kind of JSON level queries, but also graph-like queries through the JSON LD exposition. We're using standard protocols and making the data and the hub accessible through multiple routes, whether it's the UI, the hub, the API, the Python clients, the CLI, using Datalab, or as we have kind of included, the extension of using the ROS3 virtual file driver from the HDF5 group into Python tools like H5Py, which allows streaming access to this data. It's interoperable through standardization of metadata and data formats. And again, I won't go into the details of this, but we are really quite picky about using persistent identifiers to describe information in this space. And everything in Dandy is reusable. The license is specified. There's a rich metadata schema, and all the components that we use to build the infrastructure itself is released under free and open source licenses. So let's take a look at the four components, the four major components of Dandy. So we have a web UI, and you can use this to search and browse data sets. Register users, it uses the Vue.js framework, and it uses schema-based metadata editing that I referred to earlier. I'm going to slide this in under web UI. This is another way of accessing the data, is using Datalab, which is a software that can be used that's based on Git Annex to provide fully versioned, together with history of changes, a representation of each Dandy set. And it's available by cloning from GitHub or through datasets.datalab.org. Behind the UI, or the UI as a client, is served by an API. This is a Django-based framework with Postgres running on Heroku with a Terraform-based deployment. We are using pre-signed uploads to a public S3 bucket, as I mentioned earlier. But some of the changes we've made is we enable deduplication on the bucket together with e-tag verification as data are uploaded in parallel through a multi-threaded process, or actually a multi-process and multi-threaded process into the cloud. The API also uses Celery-based workers in the backend for doing additional checksum computations or other validation tasks. And finally, we generate DOIs for each data set through DataCite. The other client library is the Python CLI, and this is available to do interaction with the archive, as well as a separate library called Dandy Schema for schema manipulation. All of this manages local organization and validation of data and interacts with the API to perform uploads and download operations, does checksumming and parallel upload and download with a multi-process, multi-threaded system. So while all of these things kind of get data into Dandy, and perhaps out of it, because you can use the Python CLI to download data, we've also deployed a Jupyter Hub alongside Dandy. And this is a full Kubernetes deployment using Ansible on AWS, using multi-zone efforts, integrating EFS, using spot pricing and node customization. Now, I will note that this is very close to, but not fully turnkey. It still requires a few knobs that a human kind of has to touch to deploy it, but we should be able to turn this into a full turnkey deployment fairly soon. This Jupyter Hub framework, just like our web UI and API, interacts with GitHub OAuth, provides to anybody who wants it a full Linux desktop, choice of compute options, and singularity support to run containers. So it really expands the space of the kinds of things you could do alongside the data in Dandy. On the client side itself, one of the things that users can do is just go to Dandy and register a new data set, and then locally organize the data set, validate it, and using their API key, upload and download things. Before I move to the next portion, I'll just give you a quick preview of Dandy. So for Dandy, this is the web app. You can browse public data sets. Let's take a look at one of these data sets. And within the data set, each data set comes with metadata that is served by the API server using JSON LD format. You can download data or get instructions on how to download data. You can view the data that's stored in the data set. This is just a viewer with information that's related to each file. It also has a link out to our API server. So if I click on this, it should bring up the asset level metadata that we were just watching through our API server. And this is a fully JSON LD compliant structure. So with rich metadata that's coming in and extensible because it's a JSON LD structure with additional metadata to form a better graph. The Jupyter Hub thing, and this is again the kind of thing that most people are perhaps not used to unless they're operating on data centers locally, is the ability to select different kinds of things as you get to compute. And this allows us to configure for an individual or a group the set of options that we want to offer. And the mapping of these options all happens behind the scenes. And that allows us to kind of offer different kinds of compute capabilities to individuals coming in. I mentioned Jupyter Hub. Let's hope this starts up. Has a full desktop deployment. The standard Jupyter Hub is something I think most people here might be used to, and it has different elements. But we've enabled some kind of custom environments for being able to stream data directly from the archive, in addition to kind of pulling data through standard mechanisms. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have mechanisms to kind of generate and deploy a full desktop. So let me go back to the presentation. Actually, this should come up in a second. So you get access to kind of a full environment for interaction with other tools that are not directly notebook or lab compatible. But this didn't come for free. There are many social and technical challenges, and I'll illustrate a few of these over the next few minutes. I'm going to start with one of these examples. I mentioned the light sheet setup before. This is one of those experimental setups where it goes from a human slice of or half a human brain, a hemisphere, through slices, through microscopes that image these slices and into the cloud. There's a lot of computation that goes on to do certain kinds of corrections on the data acquired from the microscope. There's alignment between these slices and patches that's connected. There's alignment across different types of tissues, which may have distorted a little bit because of the mechanisms of the experimental process itself. And then there's inter-slab registration, atlas, and alignment along this. Now, to support this thing, we needed to both understand the kinds of data storage mechanisms, but also how it could be cloud compatible. So this is where the next generation file format comes in, which is a successor to a previous extension to TIFF called OME-TIFF to support 3D microscopy data. And this is using ZAR as its native format to support chunking of data so that it can be expanded in the cloud. Now, for the moment, we don't have support for ZAR and Dandy, but we have support for HDF5. So we are converting ZAR to HDF5, but still providing kind of serializable access and compression and all the things that ZAR is good for through HDF5, because we've enabled this into the client libraries that people use. And what that allows is for people to kind of simply go to a visualization tool, and this is a tool called NeuroGlancer, which allows individuals to zoom in through multi-resolution stacks of the data. And as you can see, the stack will itself update and change resolution because we have a multi-resolution format set up online for this. And this is all happening through this HDF5 serializable interface. So what does it mean to move a lab to the cloud? Well, there are considerations of local bandwidth and local analytics. There's a cost that a lab has to face about standardization. How do you increase fairness of the data? We're no longer talking about the individual lab, but how the lab interacts with other labs. There's a cost to store, compute, train, if you're using neural networks or other things, to disseminate data. And then together with this, there's notions of training and ethics, because you have to consider what kind of metadata and data you're putting out there. And this involves kind of thinking about data generation and processing together. The throughput is changing. We're getting to the space, at least in neuroscience, where generation of data spans anywhere from 10 gigabytes to 10 terabytes per day. Optical time series are even larger. Free behaving experiments, which are coming online at a greater speed, are going to generate even more data. Microscopy, as we've already seen, is kind of pushing the boundaries. And this is not electron microscopy. That's a whole different scale of operations. And then finally, in this space, there's a lot of simulations, which can generate anywhere from hundreds of terabytes to as much data as you want to. So how does a lab kind of think about putting these things? And this is where the challenges come in. We're looking at the evolution of science, which means it cannot always be the same file formats, compression standards, or metadata standards. We have to be able to be nimble in our movement. And by using some of the things we have done, we've kind of extended the ability for people to keep moving as these richer data sets kind of come about. There's a significant diversity of data scales. On the right, I'm showing the distribution of files on Dandy. And it ranges from things that are a few kilobytes to things that are terabytes in size. And a lot of that long tail in the upwards of 10 to hundreds of gigabytes is increasing more daily. If I think of S3, S3 itself has an object limit of 5 terabytes per object. We haven't hit that yet, but we have to start thinking about what happens when you get to those object sizes. And that's where something like ZAR kind of comes in. It allows us to expand out without making each object larger. But ZAR comes at a price. If people want to download it to their local setup instead of just being on the cloud, now they're downloading hundreds of thousands or millions of files to a system that may not have as much inodes available as the S3 bucket. So this might make sense for certain people to move between the cloud and local compute instances to better understand where they get maximal benefit given the scale of data that's being put out there. More importantly, we are storing raw data right now. And the important thing for the community is to decide what to keep. We will soon get to a place where we will not be able to store all the data that's being generated. And it's important for the culture of the lab to change from publishing to using data. to increase informatics training and pushing beyond this notion of fair. So let me end with just a couple of future directions. We're continuing to make UI, UX improvements, hub integration of more applications and algorithms, neurophysiology algorithms, other external services, and GPU-based containers. We're helping researchers increase utility of their data by conversion and integration with Dandy and better metadata search, management and search. Excuse me. And we are creating integration with various external services which serve the community because we have a full-fledged API server. So I want to summarize by saying it's a collaboration space for neurophysiology data. It needs improved metadata descriptors and community-driven data preservation. As a single archive, we might not be able to hold all the data that the neuroscience community is producing. We're also looking at future technological improvements, such as a searchable data archive that just not search in the same sense as Google search as we know it, but through query-based computing. Could you search by running a query automatically on the data, and it picks out data sets that come to you? And for us, the word distributed in the acronym DANDY is still important. We want it to be a distributed. Distributed helps us kind of increase the robustness of things. And in many cases, we might find that an instrument that produces data, let's say on MIT's campus, is just producing data at a throughput that may not be uploadable to the cloud under practical circumstances. The distributed nature allows us to flexibly deploy this architecture, whether in the cloud, whether at institutions, and best leverage migration of the relevant data to different locations or compute to data. So I want to keep that in mind as I close off. And would be happy to take any questions, and feel free to reach out at info@dandyarchive.org if you have additional thoughts or questions. I'll stop sharing and take any questions that are there.
Thank you, Satra. That was an awesome presentation. Such a vital project. So I'd like to remind our audience to drop questions in the chat as they come to you. We have a few that we've collected in advance. One question was that data storage in the cloud is often cited as not being cost competitive with on-premise solutions, both the ongoing costs of the storage and data egress charges. People understand the value of the cloud for surge compute requirements, but are nervous about storage. Could you comment on this concern?
Sure. So I have to first start by thanking AWS because we are leveraging the public dataset program, and this is open data. And AWS pays for storage and egress of the data. So it is a concern, and that's one of the things that we have to deal with. And that's where we still think the notion of a distributed archive makes sense. So some of the things we are looking at are extensions of IPFS-like technologies, which allows us to kind of build up a separate cloud archive that sits across perhaps institutions, coupled with, let's say, the open dataset program and other things. But in other cases, the cost of deploying something for a certain lab, I mean, every place does not have access to the same kinds of resources. And sometimes it's more expensive to deploy something locally than in the cloud. I think every lab has to think about this on their own, what they have access to locally, what the cost really is of data, and perhaps most importantly, what data to keep. I think in the scientific community today, we want to keep all the data because we don't know what to throw away. If I can give an example, the CERN community has dealt with this for a long time. They cannot keep all their data, but they have come together as a community to decide what to keep. If we can get that happening, and that comes through collaboration, and a place like Dandy kind of starts that process, then we might get to reducing the storage cost necessary for it.
Wonderful. Cool. And thank you, Gautam, for posting the link to the registry of open data at AWS. Jeff Lawson of AWS says data egress charges are waived by AWS for EDU clients up to a max of 15% of total AWS charges. Very few educational institutions pay data egress charges. And this is the kind of thing that if you are working with CloudBank that we will be happy to discuss with you when we're talking about your spend plan. And get you in touch with the right people at AWS to make those decisions. We have one last question. Well, we have a lot of questions, but I think we want to squeeze in one more question. Um, we heard that there are so many different technologies being mentioned in this presentation across a multitude of different software engineering domains like Django and Postgres and Vue.js. Um, how does the team make decisions about which of those technologies to use, and how do you like find the expertise to like interface with so many corners of the tech world?
So I have to say, this is a shout out to our entire team, right? I mentioned teams at Dartmouth and Kitware. Uh, I will also say, if you look at the underlying stack of technologies, Python serves as a critical kind of glue to almost all of them. So we are very Python centric. We do a lot of things with Python, but then the other pieces kind of attach itself in terms of the use cases that we need to support. And while Python serves as the glue, we kind of deliver or look into technologies from what would best support our users. And that's how we kind of come to put things together. Indeed, one of the costs of maintenance is that total stack of technologies that I mentioned. And we are trying to simplify, reduce that as time goes on. It hasn't been easy, but every step we take, we try to think about whether we add a new technology or can reuse something else. But the key thing is not reinvent something that is out there. Sometimes it's hard, but we have tried our best to reuse components that other people have produced. And we are a big believer in the open science and open access space of things. So we continue to do so.
Cool, thank you. And one more question from the chat. You mentioned ZAR to HDF5 conversion. Have you looked at HSDS? And there is a link to the hdfgroup.org's website on HSDS.
We did. The ZAR to HDF5 seemed easier for us for this particular thing. I think we still would like to think about the balance between HSDS, I think it's HSDS, and which essentially does chunking on HDF5's structures and provides kind of parallel access to it, which is similar to what ZAR is doing. We haven't made the full decisions at this point in time on what will be the long-term thing, but somebody pointed out in the chat that they're thinking of Google Maps of the brain. That's really kind of the idea, at least for a single brain. If you're collecting multimodal data, could you view it? I turn on satellite display on or local imaging display. And that's where we want these data sets to expand seamlessly. And one of the things that we found with ZAR is that might be a nice way to expand out. As I said, we don't have support for ZAR yet in the archive. It's in our plans because that also comes with how do you hash directories and other things, because one of the things that's important for us is immutability of data and tracking what is changing. And those are pieces, again, there are solutions out there, but we have to think about it in the context of our use cases. So we will absolutely continue to look at HSDS as an alternative mechanism for doing it on HDF5 data. But for now, we're happy that we provide serializable access to HDF5, which allows anybody to get to any piece or chunk of data automatically.
Yeah, it's probably a feat in itself. Okay, one last question. One last question. We have a question that is asking if you could talk about the role of cloud computing compared to on-premise computing in facilitating distributed collaborative projects and projects that embrace FAIR.
Sure. So I think everything depends on use cases. One of the use cases, so when you have such data on an archive like Dandy, cloud computing makes a whole lot of sense. You don't want to be able to move all of that data out of the cloud if you could compute. In terms of cost, there was an earlier question about storage costs. I would say compute cost is one of those places where there's a very clear advantage of being in the cloud. Storage, not so much yet. There are other factors that come into it. But compute side, the cloud. However, there's still a space of GPU-based computing, which is different, and that's evolving as we speak, where people might need to train for weeks on something, and that can easily add up for some of the fancier GPUs, technologies that are out there. So I would say it's kind of a use case-driven thing. We are running this Jupyter Hub quite minimally. And that still provides almost anybody who logs in a way to do certain types of computation. And as we move from the raw data to derived data, which might be smaller in size in many cases, that reduces the cost of computation. Another element to this is reuse of somebody else's computation. So that's on our roadmap, which is everybody does not need to compute the same things every single time. And so by creating an archive where you can share data and version it and version the computation, somebody else might say, oh, I don't need to recompute. I can use this other thing. And that changes, again, the landscape of computing in the cloud.
Excellent. Well, I think we will finally let you off the stage, but thank you so much for your presentation today, Satra.
Thank you, Naomi, and to the Rocket team for inviting me.
Cool. All right, let's stop recording this session.